The winds howled across the barren planet, carrying the bitter chill of abandonment. Among the jagged rocks and lifeless terrain, a wounded creature lay motionless. Her fur, sleek and dark with streaks of bioluminescent patterns, shimmered faintly under the pale light of the distant sun. She was a Vralyx, a predator feared across the galaxy, engineered to perfection by the Galactic Union for a war that had long since ended. Her flank bore deep scars, fresh and bleeding, and her breaths came shallow and labored. Beside her, 3 cubs, smaller replicas of their mother, huddled together, their whimpers swallowed by the roaring winds. No one was meant to be here. This planet, designated PX-77, was little more than a cosmic dumping ground. The Galactic Union had deemed the Vralyx too dangerous to keep alive, too costly to contain, and far too valuable to destroy entirely. They had been left here to die, abandoned by the cold logic of bureaucrats who saw no worth in compassion. From the gray sky above, a small salvager vessel descended, its thrusters kicking up clouds of dust. Captain Elias Quinn stepped out, his boots crunching against the rocky ground. The human wore a patched-up suit, more suited for work than survival, and his face was weathered by years of scavenging the Union's forgotten corners. PX-77 wasn't his first choice, but the promise of discarded tech was too tempting to ignore. His scanner beeped, picking up faint energy readings nearby. As he followed the signal, the landscape grew more desolate, the air tinged with a metallic scent. It wasn't long before he stumbled upon the den. The sight froze him in his tracks. A creature he'd only heard of in whispered tales lay before him, reduced to a pitiful shadow of her feared reputation. The Vralyx raised her head weakly, her golden eyes locking onto his. Elias felt his pulse quicken. Every survival instinct screamed at him to leave. The Galactic Union had left warnings in their records. Do not engage. Do not approach. High-risk predator. He took a cautious step back, his hand resting on the holster at his side. The Vralyx growled low, a warning more out of habit than strength. Her cubs whimpered again, pressing closer to her battered frame. For a moment, Elias considered turning around, heading back to his ship, and pretending he'd seen nothing. This wasn't his fight. He was a salvager, not a hero. But then he noticed something strange. Despite her growl, the Vralyx didn't lunge or bare her teeth. She simply watched him, her gaze unwavering, as though she were sizing him up. He saw no malice, no hatred, only pain and desperation. Damn it, Elias muttered under his breath. Against every ounce of his better judgment, he stepped closer. As he did, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint, pitiful cries of the cubs. In that moment, Elias Quinn, a simple human in a galaxy ruled by cold efficiency, made a choice. He couldn't walk away. Elias crouched a safe distance from the injured creature, his mind racing as he scanned the area. The Vralyx wasn't just any predator. It was a living weapon, created and perfected by the Galactic Union. He had read about them in Union records, how they were designed to be the ultimate hunters, their intelligence rivaling that of the most advanced AI. Yet here she was, battered and broken, discarded like a malfunctioning piece of equipment. His scanner hummed, and he activated a holographic feed pulled from a nearby Union beacon. Fragments of a report flickered to life. Project Apex terminated. Vralyx classified as high threat. No further resources allocated. Disposal initiated. The words were clinical, devoid of any trace of guilt or remorse. The Union hadn't just abandoned her. They had ensured her demise was slow and inevitable. Elias let the hologram flicker out and looked back at the creature. Her eyes followed his every move, unblinking and sharp despite the pain etched into her features. The cubs, barely able to stand, pressed close to their mother, their tiny bodies trembling. The sight stirred something deep within him, something the Union's warnings couldn't suppress. Humanity's history was different. Elias thought of Earth, a world where creatures once feared. Wolves, eagles, even apex predators, had found coexistence with humans. People had a way of seeing potential where others saw only danger. The Galactic Union, for all its technological advancements, lacked that vision. To them, anything no longer useful was waste. Elias reached for his pack, pulling out a small vial of nutrient serum. It wasn't much, but it might help. The mother growled weakly, her body tense, but she didn't attack. He carefully poured a few drops onto a piece of fabric and tossed it toward her. She sniffed at it cautiously before turning her attention back to her cubs. He sat back on his heels, debating his next move. The Union's warnings weren't without reason. If he tried to help her and she turned on him, it could mean his death. Worse, the Union had strict penalties for interfering with abandoned assets. They'd branded countless species as threats before wiping them out. What difference would one human make? But walking away wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. The Vralyx wasn't some mindless beast. The intelligence in her eyes was undeniable, and her refusal to strike, even in her desperate state, suggested more than primal instincts. Elias wondered if she understood what was happening, that she had been left to die, not because of her actions, but because she was inconvenient. He leaned back, staring at the gray sky above. If he left her here, she would die slowly, her cubs even faster. That would be the logical choice, the safe choice. Yet logic had never been humanity's strongest suit. Compassion, stubbornness, hope. Those were the qualities that had kept humanity alive, even in the face of galactic ridicule. With a sigh, Elias stood. "All right," he said, mostly to himself. "Let's see what makes you so dangerous." Elias set to work, moving quickly but cautiously. He approached the injured Vralyx with deliberate movements, keeping his posture low and non-threatening. Her growl was faint, more a warning than a threat, but her eyes stayed locked on him. The cubs whimpered again, their tiny bodies trembling as they pressed against their mother. Elias knelt a few feet away and set down a small kit he'd salvaged from his ship. He rummaged through the contents, finding a sterilizer spray and a small pack of protein gel. His hands hesitated. The creature might not understand his intentions, and one wrong move could end badly for both of them. "Easy," he muttered under his breath, as much to steady himself as to soothe her. Slowly, he rolled a small bit of the gel toward her. The Vralyx sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent. Her growl subsided, replaced by wary silence. Elias waited, watching as she carefully nudged the gel with her nose before licking it. Her ears flicked back, her body tense but no longer on the verge of lashing out. Taking that as a sign of fragile trust, Elias shifted his focus to the cubs. They were barely moving, their breaths shallow. He prepared another small ration and slid it closer to them. The mother made no move to stop him, though her eyes followed every motion. The smallest cub was the first to respond, wobbling forward on unsteady legs to nibble at the food. Seeing this, the others followed, their hunger overriding their fear. Elias allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but the situation was far from resolved. The mother was in worse shape than he'd thought. Her wounds, likely inflicted by other abandoned predators on the planet, were deep and untreated. Infection had already begun to set in. He sprayed the sterilizer on a cloth and edged closer. She growled again, though weaker this time. "I'm trying to help you," he said, holding the cloth where she could see it. After a tense pause, she lowered her head, resting it against the rocky ground. Elias reached out, working quickly to clean the gashes. Her muscles twitched under his touch, but she didn't retaliate. It was almost as if she understood that he wasn't a threat. As he worked, the sky above darkened. A storm was brewing, one of the acid rains common to PX-77. Elias cursed under his breath. The shelter she'd chosen was little more than a shallow alcove, barely enough to keep the rain off her cubs. He needed to move them, and fast. Returning to his ship, he retrieved a collapsible stretcher and thermal blankets. The mother stiffened when he returned, her ears flattening, but she didn't attack. Gently, he guided the cubs onto the stretcher, wrapping them securely. When he turned to her, she hesitated, her golden eyes flicking between him and her cubs. "I'm not leaving them," Elias said firmly. Her gaze lingered, then she shifted slightly, allowing him to lift her. It wasn't trust, not entirely, but it was enough. The storm loomed closer, But Elias moved with purpose, carrying them all towards safety. The storm hammered against the salvager ship, acidic rain sizzling against the hull as Elias powered the engines. Inside, the Vralyx and her cubs rested in the cargo bay, the warmth of a thermal field surrounding them. The mother's breathing was steadier now, though she remained alert, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. The cubs, nestled against her side, had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Elias adjusted the ship's course, steering toward an uncharted sector far beyond Union-controlled space. It was a gamble. He had no idea if the coordinates he remembered from an old smuggler's map still led to the sanctuary, a remote haven rumored to be safe for displaced creatures. But he had no other options. The Union patrols would scan for unauthorized activity in this region soon enough. The console beeped, a proximity alert flashing across the screen. Elias's stomach tightened. A Union drone ship was sweeping the planet's orbit. If it scanned his cargo hold, it would detect the Vralyx immediately. He muttered a curse under his breath and began recalibrating the ship's signal dampeners. The mother Vralyx shifted, a low rumble emanating from her throat. Elias glanced back and found her staring at him, her gaze intense but no longer hostile. For a moment he thought about what this might mean. Was she beginning to trust him? Or was it simply the instinct of a wounded creature recognizing the one keeping her alive? Either way, there was no turning back. The drone's signal came closer. Elias activated the ship's stealth mode, cutting all unnecessary systems and dimming the interior lights. The hum of the engines dulled, replaced by an eerie silence. He held his breath as the scanner swept over his ship. The seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last, until finally, the alert faded. The drone moved on, unaware of its quarry. Elias exhaled slowly and powered the engines back up. The Vralyx's rumble quieted as she settled her head on her paws, watching him. "You're welcome," he muttered, a wry smile tugging at his lips. The journey to the sanctuary stretched on, but the destination was worth it. The planet emerged from the starfield like a hidden gem, its surface lush and green, untouched by the Union's grasp. Elias guided the ship through the atmosphere and landed near a dense forest. The air was fresh, the scent of life a stark contrast to PX-77's barren wasteland. Elias lowered the ramp and stepped aside, letting the Vralyx decide. She rose slowly, her movements cautious, her cubs trailing behind her. For a moment, she paused at the edge of the ramp, her eyes scanning the forest. Then, with a graceful leap, she led her cubs into the wilderness, disappearing among the trees. He stood there for a while, watching the forest's edge, knowing he might never see them again. But that wasn't the point. He had defied the Union, risked everything because it was the right thing to do. Humanity wasn't perfect, but its greatest strength had always been its refusal to abandon those in need. And in a galaxy ruled by cold pragmatism, perhaps that made all the difference.